Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Matthews. I'm the marketing coordinator here at AdvisoCon. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Best Practices and Approaches Using Microsoft Project. Here at AdvisoCon, we are a group of authors, teachers, consultants, and technologists who are passionate about helping organizations learn, scale, and grow with a mix of methodology and technology to deliver results. Recently, AdvisoCon has stepped into a new area using project management for community involvement by integrating a nonprofit and community outreach department. We offer free bi-weekly webinars that we refer to as Webinar Wednesdays, in which we spend 30 minutes to an hour teaching topics ranging from Microsoft Project, Project Server, Project Online, Power BI, Visio, SharePoint, Project Program and Portfolio Management, and methodology approaches. With attending any of our training sessions, we offer PDUs, as we are a registered education provider with the Project Management Institute. At the close of today's session, I will give some instructions on how to claim those PDUs and how to contact AdvisoCon with any questions you may have. So before we get started, I want to go over a few things so you know how to participate in today's event. So if you could please review the control menu that should be on the top right of your screen. This control panel gives you the option to adjust the volume and most of your other settings. The audience is muted during our session, so in order to ask questions, you'll need to submit text questions in either the chat window or the questions window of the control panel. And it is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Kevin Bruder. He's our Director of Products here at AdvisoCon. So without further ado, I'll hand this presentation over so we can get started with this webinar.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So today we have an exciting webinar. We are going to be talking about best practices in scheduling in Microsoft Project. So we have done some similar sessions. We've been kind of diving into some of the advanced best tips and tricks about resource loading and a whole bunch of other slew of features in Project, and some of that we've kind of skipped over a lot of just some general best practices around scheduling. So today we're going to do a comprehensive review of just scheduling and some best practices to follow and some ways to utilize Project to get a lot of efficiencies and make your job easier as a project manager. So we're going to go over just some best practices. We're going to show you what benefits you can get from following those best practices, and then we'll go over some kind of common mistakes and how to avoid them, and then I will demo all of those things in Project, so it should be fun. So let's get started. We'll start off by just talking about some best practices. So when building a project schedule, and in here we're going to focus mostly just about actual scheduling, so tasks, dates, just building a schedule. We'll save the resource loading and other advanced parts of a schedule for later. So just talking about some general best practices. A good Microsoft Project schedule should be linked and utilizing the scheduling engine. So what that means is you should be able to make changes to your schedule later on, as you're executing your project, and Project should be able to help you with those changes, those status updates as people are completing tasks early or late, or you need to move dates or new tasks, new scope creep, things creep in. When we build a good schedule, those things should be very easy to manage. Project will figure out impacts to our schedule and do a lot of things automatically for us. And so in order to enable that, we need to have a fully linked schedule. And that doesn't necessarily mean, you'll hear lots of comments and best practices about this, and that every single task should have a predecessor and so forth and so on. And while those are all very good best practices, fully to me means correctly. So you want to have all the correct links between tasks within your schedule. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that'll enable Project to do things automatically for you. Project cannot help you unless you tell it how. And so first step is making sure that we've got all the right predecessors and successors in our schedule between different tasks. And that's what I'm referring to when I'm saying links. After that, we want to enable some things to tell Project the proper critical path. So one of the things that I think is highly underutilized is deadlines. And deadlines is a field that's out of the box in project that you can set on every task, or just the tasks that need deadlines. But it allows you to set a date that that task must complete by in order to meet some type of deliverable. So it's not going to actually drive dates per se, and that it won't move your start or finish date. It's not like setting a constraint, but it will tell project that, hey, there's a deadline on this task. I need this task to finish by that date. And so I'm going to show you how to use those. And if you haven't used them before, I think it's one of those features that will help you avoid some of the mistakes that people commonly make when they didn't know the deadline feature was there. Other best practices, using milestones, but only when appropriate. So we don't really want to schedule with milestones. We can, but we want to use milestones to really signify what a milestone is. So, maybe a series of tasks leads to some type of deliverable. That's a good time to use milestones. But we don't necessarily want our entire schedule to be linked off of milestones and driving our schedule. We want to drive our schedule with tasks. And using all those things, we can then examine things like our critical path, examine our slack, and we can use all those types of metrics to help us find out things about our schedule, how to make things happen sooner, impacts of tasks slipping, and so forth and so on. And we'll show you some of that. Things to avoid, right? We only want to have the right links and the right constraints. Avoiding all constraints in your schedule, great, but usually not possible. But we definitely want to avoid having too many constraints. Same story goes for lags and leads. We'll talk about those a little bit more in the demo too. We want to avoid them wherever possible. Sometimes not possible to completely avoid them, but not having really long lags or a lot of them can create a lot of clutter and unknowns in your schedule. Long duration tasks. I have a great example of this one. You don't want to have long duration tasks because it lowers your confidence. It's not necessarily a technical thing in project, but the longer that task is, the less likely you are to be confident in it finishing on time. We want to avoid all items on summary tasks. We want to keep our summary tasks what they are, just summaries. So they should just roll up the information from the tasks below them. We don't want to have logic on our summary tasks. And we've talked about before, we don't want to have assignments on our summary tasks either. But today we'll focus on not having logic on our summary tasks. I'll show you some examples of that too. And then to take advantage of what project is giving you, we want to avoid manually scheduled tasks. It is a feature in project. Some people use it. It basically turns your project schedule into an Excel spreadsheet. So if you need more of that type of view, you might not even need project. So turning off the scheduling engine for tasks just creates a lot of problems. You won't be able to take advantage of things like your critical path and your Slack and all really the great benefits you get of using a tool like Project. So wherever possible, with the schedule, we want to avoid manually scheduled tasks. And I've got an example of that as well. So if we follow these best practices and avoid those items, some of the benefits we're going to get is we'll easily be able to identify impacts. So as things change, as new tasks get added, as tasks slip, people finish things early, people finish things late, we'll easily be able to tell how that impacts our schedule. The other thing we'll be able to do is the reverse of that. When our stakeholders come to us and say, we need this sooner, we need you to finish this project sooner, we need this specific milestone sooner, I need you to pull that to the left. We'll be able to go to our schedule and figure out how we can make that happen, if we can make that happen. And if we can't, we'll be able to have clear data that shows why. So it's really it's probably one of the most common things that project managers experience is, no, I need it done faster. And this gives you either the reasoning behind why you can't or what you need to be able to do to make it happen faster, whether it's reprioritizing resources or otherwise. The same goes for different tasks. If people are saying, I can't do that this week, I need to push that to next week. And so you'll be able to look at your Slack and determine, okay, is that going to cause a problem? Is that going to cause me to miss a deadline? If you got a good schedule, these things will be very easy to tell. And just in general, all your ongoing, as you update your schedule, it'll make things nice and easy. Dates will be automatically calculated for you, and you'll be able to quickly identify how those impacts your overall schedule. Another great thing that I've got on here is scenario planning. So as you're building a schedule and you're not in the execution phase, you're more in the planning phase. One of the things that's nice is being able to say, well, what if we didn't start this project for a couple months? And you can easily just move the start date of the project, and the whole rest of your schedule will automatically calculate. And that's really nice, especially when we get into project server, project online. It becomes very important because as we're looking at resource planning across the whole portfolio of projects, we need to be able to pick up projects that we haven't started yet and move them to different spots in the timeline and determine how that impacts our resources. So we can see where we have resource overlaps and things like that. So when we're doing our portfolio analysis and our portfolio planning, it's really important to have good schedules. So that way we can just pick them up and move them, and everything else will automatically calculate properly. And then going from just where we're talking about today, which is just going to be about scheduling, to like next levels, next steps, and maturity and so forth, when you start to resource load, everything's going to be a lot easier. If you start with a good base schedule, resource loading will be a lot easier too. You'll have a lot less of those scenarios where, man, project's not doing what I want it to. You'll have a lot less of those if we have a good schedule to start with. Common mistakes. So this is going to be where hopefully these things may sound familiar, hopefully things you've done in the past and aren't doing today, but we'll go through. These are just some common things that people do when they first get into project, maybe didn't get any real good training, and they're just trying to build a schedule. My first and most important one is quite simply, don't set dates. In project, I think that's the most common thing. People are like, I got to build a schedule. Let me go in here. When is this going to start? When is that going to finish? And people are just picking dates. When we pick dates in project, especially in auto schedule mode, project has to make those tasks stick to that date, or it's going to try to do what you're telling it to do. And when you pick a start date for a task, project has to somehow get that task to stay at that start date, because in auto schedule mode, by default, all tasks will just start at the project start. And so what happens is you end up creating constraints, you end up maybe creating links that you didn't mean to, and project is not, when it does create constraints, it sometimes really doesn't create good constraints. It has to get your dates to try and get you what you asked it to do, and sometimes that creates some really funky constraints that really you didn't mean to create. And so best way to avoid that is just don't set dates. You want to drive your schedule from other parameters like setting duration and setting your links, and then any constraints that you might need. Next thing, kind of related, is avoid unneeded constraints. So if you're saying, I want this task to start on this day, really think about that before you set the constraint, because we should only set real constraints. So if you're going to set a constraint like this task must start on this day, is that really a physical constraint? Is there something in this project or in space that says this task must start on that day or cannot start before that day? Whatever type of constraint that you're setting. And if the answer is yes, then sure, that constraint is valid and go ahead and put it in your schedule. But if the answer is no, and you just kind of got a feeling you want it to start there, probably shouldn't be setting that constraint. We should get that task to that area through a different method. The same goes for links. So when we're setting predecessors and successors, we don't want to just set links to tasks to kind of get the dates to line up. Those predecessors and successors should be real. So if you're setting a finish to start, which is a normal predecessor, you are saying that this task 2 cannot start until task 1 is done. And as long as that statement is true in the sense of the physical space in terms of your project, like you can't build a house until you get the boards, right? As long as that statement is true, you're good. That's a good constraint to set. That's a good link to set, rather, in your project. But if you're just setting constraints just so that kind of tasks come after each other, that's not usually a good practice, because you're telling project things that it's going to make decisions on later. So we want to set the correct constraints and links. We talked about avoiding anything on summary tasks, so keep our summary tasks roll-ups only. Don't put any logic on them. Don't put any assignments on them. And then last tip is keep your schedule simple. As much as we're going to look at some complicated schedules here today, don't add anything that doesn't need to be there, right? So we don't want to just have a whole ton of milestones. That's one of the most common things I see, and when I'm examining people's schedules, is they've got minor milestones and major milestones and a whole bunch of extra milestones that really aren't needed in their schedule. And although it doesn't cause any technical problems, when you're looking at the schedule and trying to diagnose it and understand different areas and inspect your slack and your critical path, it can create a lot of mud in the water. So keep it simple. Really only put what you need to have in your schedule there, but it's got to be the right amount. You do need to have everything that you need to have there. So there's not really a good err on the side of caution statement for any of these constraints, links, or just in general. You have to have the right amount of stuff in your schedule, not too much and not too little. And so with that, we're going to get out of the slides here and we're going to jump into some demos. So I've got here now on the screen a Microsoft project schedule. This is actually, I think, a demo out of like the Microsoft demo database. This schedule is very well linked. I mean, there's definitely some things in here that could be improved, but we've got a schedule here where you can see that our tasks all, are linked to each other. It's about halfway through our execution at the moment. We don't have any constraints in this schedule, which is nice. And you can see that, it goes, all our tasks are linked, and we can see in the Gantt chart kind of our project schedule. So some quick tips when we're starting to examine a schedule. First things I like to look at is our critical path, and also with that, our slack. And so quick tip in project to quickly see your critical path. You've got lots of different ways to do it, using a field. There's a field that shows you whether a task is critical or not. You can create a highlight rule that highlights tasks off of that field. But one of my favorite ways is just in the Gantt chart. If you right click anywhere, go to show hide bar styles and click on critical tasks here. This is going to add a bar style to your Gantt chart to show you the critical tasks in your schedule, and it will make them red. So what is this showing us now? Well, all the tasks that are red are on our critical path, and in project, your critical path is any task that any slip to it, any date change would impact the end date of your project. So all the tasks that need to be complete on time so that the end date of your project is maintained. And the end date of your project is, of course, the last task in your project, the greatest finish date. And so by using this, we can quickly see that all these red tasks here, these are super important if we want to finish this project on time. These are the ones that we have to keep an eye on, that we have to make sure don't slip. But these tasks that aren't red, these have what we call slack. And we can actually visualize that in the Gantt chart too by going once again to the show hide bar styles and turning on slack. And that adds these little lines right over here that extend beyond the bar. That shows you your slack in your schedule, which means that task can slide. This one here, which is what row are we on here? Row 34, develop integration test plans, so forth. This task can slide all the way out into May somewhere, and it won't impact our schedule. It won't impact our end date of our project. It's totally fine. So if someone comes to you and says, we need more time on that, you can come and quickly look at your schedule and say, yep, that's totally fine. Doesn't cause me any problems. So you can quickly visualize that in the Gantt chart, which is great. You can also see these things in your schedule, right? So especially with Slack, it's really helpful to insert the total Slack column, which will show you in days how many days of Slack you have, which means this task here that says 20 can finish 20 days later than it's currently scheduled to, and it won't impact the end date of our project. Really great a feature to have so that you know exactly how much that task can slip or not slip before it impacts the end date of your project. The next thing I want to show you is, we mentioned earlier in the slides, is deadlines. So deadlines are very, very handy. You can add a deadline in multiple places. We can look at, maybe we need this training materials complete. We promise that would be done by a certain date. maybe that date is the date it's currently scheduled, which is the 5th of April, which was actually a couple days ago, but ignoring that, we can come in here and tell project that that is a deadline. So you've got multiple ways to do this. Of course, you can add it in as a column, just like any other column you would want to add in a project, or you can come into the task information window, and the deadline is right here. So multiple ways to add a deadline. And it works just like any other date field and project. So we can pop this open and we can say, yep, it's got a deadline that needs to finish on April 5th. Now, if you were following closely, what just happened here is you'll notice that our critical path over here changed and also our slack changed. And so in project, your critical path, as I mentioned earlier, is the path you take to get to the final date in your project, right? Anything that would impact the end date of your project. Also included in the critical path is deadlines. And so as you insert a deadline, like we did here, you can see now our slack has changed and our critical path has changed, and all these tasks here have now become critical. Whereas if I undo that, we'll see that previously we had 10 days of slack. And so this is good because it tells project that, hey, no, you know what? We actually can't finish this 10 days late because we promised we'd get the training materials to the printer by this date. So we need to have that deadline in there. And that tells project now, hey, you actually don't have any slack in these. You got to get these done on time. Otherwise, you won't meet this deadline. So really great feature to use, and rather than doing a constraint, right? Rather than doing an actual constraint where we've told project this must finish by that date, the deadline is much better because it shows us that it affects our critical path but does not overly constrain our schedule. A great feature too, if you need to dive through a complicated schedule, right? This one isn't too bad, but it's still pretty complicated. If you're looking at this training materials complete, and let's say that our deadline actually we found out we got to finish this by that Monday, so we actually have to finish it by 4/2. What we see now is we also get a nice icon that we're missing our deadline, and our slack now is actually negative, meaning we are missing that deadline by 3 days. We need to make up 3 days in our schedule. How do we do that? We've got to trace back from this task through our schedule to figure out where we can make up 3 days worth of time. And in this schedule, starting here, it's not too bad. We know that the predecessor is 55, which is the line above that. And if we can't make up any time there, we know the predecessor above that's 54 and so forth. Not too bad to trace back and figure out where we're going. But as you start to get situations like this, where we have a task with 4 predecessors on it, that can be much harder to figure out what is driving your schedule and how will a change affect it. There's a great feature in project for this called the task inspector. So if you come up to the menu here and click on inspect, it's going to pop open on your left hand side a tool that will show you what is driving the dates of your schedule. And it looks like I might have clicked too many times there, but this will allow you in this inspector window here to show you the factors that are affecting your task's date. What is driving this? So on this task here, it has 4 predecessors, but over here in the task inspector, you will see that it is showing you this is the one, task number 31, that is actually driving the date. So, and the great part is these are all links. So as you're going backwards, you can say, okay, what's task 31? Okay, it's the development complete. What's driving that? Task 30, okay. And you can just click through and go through your schedule, basically tracing back through your critical path or even not your critical path. So it's really nice to be able to trace through. And in that example, if you needed to figure out where to make up 3 days, you could just keep going back and saying, okay, on this task, no, that's too short. We can't make that up there. Okay, maybe we can finalize the materials in 2 days instead. And then, let's go back one more. Oh, this one's only 3. No, we actually only need 1 day for that. And now that you've shortened your schedule, your total slack is back to 0. You're good. You'll meet your deadline. And so it's really nice to be able to trace back and go through that whole path that leads up to that task to figure out how to make up some time. Real quickly, I just want to show you a bad schedule. So if we look at another quick schedule here, and these are some of the things that we wanted to avoid, right? If we were doing that same trace back thing and we had to go back through tasks and figure out, where to make up some time, we might hit one of our problem areas, which we talked about, which was a long duration task. So we might get back to there and go, oh, that's 90 days. Well, we only need to make up 3 days in our previous example. We can just make that 87 days, right? No problem. And that while that's true and great to think about, what that kind of tells you is that task, you have no confidence in that duration. If you're not worried about changing it, obviously you probably aren't that confident that it's actually going to take 90 days. And so that's why we want to avoid long duration tasks. The same goes for long lags or too many lags, right? So this over here, where this task has a lag of 15 days, you might go back to that one and say, we can just make that lag 12 days, no big deal. And that's because lag you can't see. It's not a task. You can't tell what's going on during that time period. And so it makes it, you don't have good confidence when you're changing those items. And so that's why we want to avoid lags, especially long lags, in our schedule. We only want to have things that are really lags. This task cannot start until 15 days after that task finishes. And there's not many situations where that actually happens. Another thing we talked about was overly constraining our schedule. If we look over in our Gantt chart, this task here has a constraint on it that says it must start on a certain date, or actually I think it's a must finish on a certain date. And what you'll notice in our Gantt chart is that task is showing as critical, even though clearly in our Gantt chart, it should have slack here. So what happened is, because we used a hard constraint, we've now made this a critical task. And so that's why I want to be really careful with those hard constraints, because maybe it is a critical task and you truly do want to have that representation there. But if that's not the case, you definitely want to be careful about that, because now we've just told project that's a critical item that we cannot miss, cannot move. And so project has to work around that when it's scheduling. Another thing we talked about was logic on summary tasks. So we've got a summary task in here, and you can see I've got a predecessor on it, and I've got a task that's linked off of it. We want to avoid that as well. In this situation, it's not too bad because this is a super simple schedule. And so we're looking at even the Gantt chart over here, we can see what is actually driving those items. It's this task finish date that's then driving that one. But as you start to have more complex links, and if you've got start to starts and things like that, it becomes very confusing for you to process. And so rather than saying, well, this task is dependent on the summary, maybe this task is actually dependent on task C here, the last task in that section, or so forth and so on. The other key place where this causes problems is later on. Maybe this, is some summary component like building your house, and you forgot about a task that you need to add in. So you add a task in that maybe isn't that critical. Maybe it's like, we got to paint, right? We forgot to paint. So you add in the paint, and it ends up driving the whole rest of your schedule, like this task here, because it's going to be further out, maybe adding it later, right? So what ends up happening is your summary task will expand, which will then drive anything dependent on it. And it can quickly become very confusing and very problematic. So you want to avoid any type of logic on summary tasks, even though project will let you do it. It's just generally not a good idea. The last thing we talked about, the last thing I'll show you here, is manual scheduled tasks. And so in that example, this task, of course, is just manually scheduled. I just set some dates and a duration. And in that example, if we wanted to save some time, shorten up our schedule, maybe this long duration task, we say, it's only going to take 75 days. If you look over in our Gantt chart, what just happened is that manually scheduled task, of course, because it's manual, did not move. And what happened is almost the entire rest of our schedule, except for this task that has that constraint on it, is now no longer critical. In other words, the only task in your schedule that matters anymore is this one. And that's probably not accurate, right? You probably have all these other tasks that are pretty important tasks, but because this one's manually scheduled, this is now driving your date. You can see how a manually scheduled task can quickly screw up your critical path and take things off your critical path that should be there, and vice versa. So that is some of the things we want to avoid, and kind of showing you why. And that is actually all the time we have for our demo today. So before we close out, I want to check in with Amanda to see if we have any questions.
We do have one quick question. It says, is it important to have your schedule dependencies associated to a single start date, like a contract sign-off?
That's a good question. I would say no. I really like to think about your dependencies as being what is actually driving that task, right? So what else in your schedule, and if we're thinking about just simple finish to start dependencies, what else in your schedule has to be done before that task can start? And if you think about that from a physical sense rather than from a scheduling sense, it'll really help you determine which tasks should be dependencies, which tasks should be predecessors to that task. If part of your project plan is like getting a contract signed off or so forth, and that's at the beginning of your schedule, then a lot of things might be driven off of getting that signed contract, right? A lot of tasks might not be able to start until you have a contract signed off. And so tasks like that do tend to become good, extremely important pivot points in your schedule that will cause a lot of things to slide. But it's really good to show in your schedule, because then when those types of tasks are taking longer than expected, you can clearly show your leadership team, who's maybe the one you're waiting on for the sign off, the impact that that's causing to the rest of your schedule. We really want to put the real constraints in there as well. So, if you actually can start something before that sign off, then don't make that a dependency, because we don't want to say that, well, yeah, we kind of started this ahead of time, and then all of a sudden your schedule gets kind of screwed up. So, really look at what is a real dependency, and that's how I would determine what predecessors to set.
That's great, Kevin. Thank you. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Best Practices and Approaches Using Microsoft Project. We welcome your questions, suggestions, and your feedback. So for more information, you can contact Kevin or our Director of Operations, Pam Greensky. Once you exit today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and you will need to complete and submit the survey in order to receive your PDUs. From there, you'll receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with your PDU information. So on behalf of AdvisoCon, Kevin, and myself, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you participate in future webinars. Have a great day, everyone.